You're stripped to be square. Okay, this boy gone lost his mind. Or maybe he's just excited to start this Quilty Math series. Maybe both. You know, I better stop that before Uncle Huey Lewis strikes me for a copyright infringement. When I first learned quilting, I didn't have a structured class or have any kind of professional curriculum. Ooh, big word there. Since I'm a graduate of YouTube University and an alumnus of over 10 years, well, I just learned how to sew different quilting units kind of randomly. And there wasn't any natural progression to things. I mean, I learned how to sew an HSD before I knew how to sew two squares together. Now, I didn't know any better because, well, it was YouTube University and you just kind of learn from whatever tutorial you find. Now, if I could go back in time, yeah, I would kind of rearrange and structure everything so that it does have some kind of natural progression. Why am I mentioning this? Well, this is how I structured this series. And we're going to start with one of the most basic quilting units, the strip and the square. A little bit of an update here. You see, when I planned out this particular video, there was a lot of topics that I didn't realize I crammed into one single video. And when I started filming it and editing and putting all those video segments together, well, it was almost 2 hours long. I'm not here to make a full-fledged documentary. So instead, what I decided to do was kind of cut the video down into two separate parts. But that also required me to put in these little anecdotes here and there. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, it's because you're probably going to notice that there's wardrobe changes. I think I changed costumes more than a Cher concert. And you'll see some set design changes. But this was just so that I didn't have to refilm the entire video. I could just kind of put or inject certain parts of the video with an update. Just so you know, that's what happened. Back to the lesson. Now you might think that strips and squares don't really make exciting quilting units or quilting blocks, but as simple as it is, they can create beautiful quilts. More than anything else, from this video, I want you to get a solid understanding of the concepts and calculations that I'm about to share with you because, well, this will give you a strong foundation for everything we talk about in this series. So with that said, let's dive into this. So before we dive into the meat and guts of this video, let's start off with defining a few key terms that you often hear in quilting. The first one that I kind of feel like I need to explain what I mean by this is finish versus unfinished. Now you hear those two terms quite often in quilting, but well, what do people exactly mean? Because when I ask the person when they say something is unfinished or something is finished, well, I get different definitions. Some people might say that a finished quilt block means that it's sewn into the quilt top, whereas in an unfinished quilt block, they haven't been sewn together into the rows or it's not in the quilt top. I'm going to go with a slightly different definition for the purposes of this quilting series. Here's what I mean. Now, when I say finished size, well, I'm going to specifically mean that all sides of the fabric piece or the quilting unit, whatever we're talking about, those are all sewn or attached to something else. Case in point, take a look at this. So the block overall is unfinished because there's nothing sewn here, there's nothing on the sides, there's nothing sewn on the bottom here. But if we are looking for, or if I'm specifically talking or referring to this middle unit here, most of us will recognize this as a four patch. This will be a finished quilting unit. Why? Because from that four patch, I got something sewn on the top, I got something sewn on the bottom, and I got something sewn on each on the left and the right sides. So since all the sides are sewn or attached to another piece of fabric or another quilting unit, when I refer to just that center portion, that's finished. Now, for the purposes of this series, finished and unfinished, well, it's going to be kind of an important distinguishment because I might be talking about the specific unit, or I might be referring to the entire quilt block. So I'll try my best to actually distinguish or at least make it clear what I'm referring to when it comes to finished and unfinished. Now, the last definition that I want to kind of mention is, well, you might hear this term if you're talking to a pattern writer or a quilt designer, and it's the term layout. What do I mean by that? Most quilt blocks, well, they're laid out in a grid formation, for example. You can kind of see that there's a grid here where there's 4 squares on the top and 4 squares going vertically, and the seams are kind of running horizontal and vertically here. Most of you would probably recognize this as a 16 patch. How about this one? You see the grid? There's a square here, square here, square here, square here. And again, most of you would recognize this as a 4-patch unit. When pattern writers or pattern designers, when they refer to a quilt block layout, what they're usually referring to is the grid formation. And it's commonly expressed in one of 3 different ways. There's the 4-patch. Yeah, 4-patch. 4-patch. There's the 9-patch. And then there's the 16-patch. So have a look at this layout here, where there's 3 squares on the top and 3 squares in each column. Again, most of you would probably recognize that as a 9-patch. But what I want you to kind of be more familiar with is just the fact that there's 3 squares and 3 squares here. That's what I refer to as the layout. So I would call something like this a 9-patch layout, whereas in this would be a 4-patch layout. When you make a patchwork quilt block, it's usually in a square shape. But that overall square is subdivided into smaller square units. And if you really think about it, well, I can take each of those smaller square units and replace it with a different kind of quilting unit, and that's where I can get the variations of the different quilt block designs. Let's go back to this quilt block. This is in a 16-patch layout. Okay, there's 1 square. There's your 2nd square there, 3rd square, 4th square. Oh, let me move that. There's the 4th square. Then when you look at the vertical, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So this overall, this quilt block is designed in a 16-patch layout. Okay? Now, I know what some of you are going to say. Eric, take a look at that flying geese unit, which is this guy here. There's no seam right there in the middle, so how can you call that in a 16-patch layout? I chose to put these flying geese units, chose to make it as one solid flying geese unit. Now, for those of you, or most of you probably already know that you could take 2 half-square triangle units and sew them together to make a flying geese unit, which is what I could have done, because here's half of it, there's the other half of it. But it's still, I mean, I can still break it down into that square-ish or a square shape. So take a look at the 2 blocks side by side, or top and bottom. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. The only difference between this block and this block, other than the obvious use of different fabrics, is the units that make up each block. Whereas this is just squares, but this is a combination of squares as well as flying geese units or half-square triangles. But both of these, they're in a 16-patch layout. So now it's your turn. Take a look at this block here, and let me ask, is this in a 4-patch layout? Is it in a 9-patch layout? Or is this in a 16-patch layout? This is a little tricky because there's actually 2 different answers that you can give for this. It's just a matter of how you construct the block. What do I mean by that? Well, the way I constructed this was actually in a 4-patch layout, because there's one square here, there's another square here, and the final square here, 4-patch layout. However, I could have actually constructed this block in the 16-patch layout. How? There's one square. Now, although this purple piece is actually one solid piece here, I could have actually broken it down to one square there, and then a half square triangle here, or there's your second square. Same thing with this pink piece, one square there, or I could have broken it down into one square there and another square there, but I sewed it as one, or I created the block using just one solid piece. Then of course your half square triangle here is the final square. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 16-patch. But again, I constructed this as a 4-patch. So if you said either 4-patch or 16-patch, you're on the right track. Now, some of you would already recognize this particular block as a rail fence block, and well, that's what it is. But is it a 9-patch, is it a 16-patch, or is it a 4-patch? Well, let's have a look. There's one square there, second square is there, and your third square is there. So that means this whole quilt block is in a 3x3 layout, 9-patch. But take a look at the individual square units, because how they're constructed is with these strips, but they end up making a square shape. So the bottom line point that I really want to get across by pointing out what is a design layout is just simply this. I think it's easy to see design layouts when each of the square shapes are actual squares. But when you start getting into the more advanced quilting or patchwork quilting units, it's not that it's more advanced, it's just that you take one of those square shapes and you replace it with a different square quilting unit, or a different quilting unit that is a square shape. And it's just as simple as that. So here, this is a 4-patch, but so is this. The difference being that I took out these 2 green squares and I took out the 2 white squares, I should say, and replaced it with an even smaller 4-patch that measures, or the finished size would come out to be about the same as what this original these 2 white squares are. So when you start getting into the challenge quilt or the challenge blocks, I'm gonna probably mention if it's a 9-patch layout, if it's a 4-patch layout, if it's a 16-patch layout, maybe a 25-patch layout, maybe. But that's one of the big hints that I'm gonna be giving to you, is that it's gonna be constructed, or the way to construct it is into a certain kind of 4-patch layout, 9-patch layout, 16-patch layout. That'll give you a hint as to how the block is constructed. If you want to start designing your own quilt blocks, try and figure out what design layout. Is it a 4-patch? Is it a 9-patch? Is it a 16-patch? From there, you can kind of then start to see the individual quilting units that make up that overall quilt block. Now, in patchwork quilting, majority of your quilt blocks are square shapes, or they're square. But you do have the rare instances where they could be more rectangular. Even though it's in a rectangular shape, you can still put a grid over it and kind of see how the block, or what type of layout that quilt block has. Okay, so we talked about the quilt layout or the quilt block layout, but how does that actually refer to the math behind constructing the quilt block? Well, let's start digging into that. Now, if you guys are math whizzes or math experts, or maybe you deal a lot with numbers on a daily basis, You probably already know this, but for the rest of us, well, let me kind of explain something about the properties of math. You see, with math, you can either take individual units and build it up to something, or you can take the end result and try and break it down into figuring out what the individual units are. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at this equation. If I add 4 plus another 4, that equals 12. Or put another way, 4 times 3 because I added 4 to itself 3 different times, that equals 12. In this case, the number 4 represents the size of the individual unit, and the number 3 represents how many units needed to build up to 12. But the reverse can also be the same, because if I take 12, subtract 4, subtract another 4, I get 4. Or 12 divided by 3, and I'll get 4. In the first case, we know what the individual unit is and build it up. But in the second case, we have the end result and we broke it down to the individual unit. So, how does that relate to quilting? Sometimes you have the individual pieces and you want to know what length or size the unit will finish to when it's all sewn together. Other times, you know what the finished size of the quilt block is, and you want to figure out what size to cut your fabric pieces or what the unfinished size of each unit needs to be. I call this building up a block or breaking it down. The two kind of work hand in hand since the calculations work in opposite directions, so if you can figure out the math one way, you can also figure out the opposite. If you want to create your own quilt blocks or design your own quilts, then learning to break down a block would be more useful for you. This is because it's more common for you to start with the end in mind. You will probably know what the block should look like and what size it should finish at. From there, you can calculate the unfinished size of each unit needed or what size to cut your fabric pieces. Now, for each challenge block in this series, you'll probably be using this breakdown method more than the build-up method. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that knowing the build-up method is useless. This is because, again, sometimes you have a fabric piece or pieces of fabric that is already pre-cut to a certain size, and you want to figure out what you can create with it. Plus, you can use the build-up method to kind of double-check your calculations. Now, I will explain the calculations on both methods, but I will start with the breakdown method. This is because the math behind it is somewhat easier to understand, and it's a more common technique. Then we will go into the build-up method. Now, the calculations behind it are a bit more involved, but knowing how a block breaks down can definitely help you understand how to build it back up. Now, before I go into these calculations, make sure that you understand the concept of the layout or the quilt block layout as previously explained. This is because you'll start to see how the layout of the quilt block ties in with the math behind it. The calculations behind the breaking down method is, well, it's pretty simple, and you may have already kind of figured it out. First, determine what the finished size of the quilt block is. Then determine the layout of the quilt block. Is it a 4-patch? Is it a 9-patch? Is it a 16-patch? Maybe a 25-patch? Knowing this will determine how many individual squares or units will make up each row or column. Then take the finished size of the quilt block. Divide it by the number of units in each row or column based upon the layout, and that will give you the finished size of each square or unit that you need to construct. So for example, if this is in a 9-patch layout, that means 3 by 3. If this is supposed to be 12 finished, I can figure out what size each of these squares need to be. So I can take 12 inches and I'll divide that by, in a 9-patch layout, it's 3 squares across, 3 squares in each column. So I'll divide that by 3 and I get 4 inches. This will finish into a 12-inch block. There's a block here, or there's a square unit here, square unit here, square unit here. If I want this to be a 12-inch finished quilt block, each of those square units have to be 4 inches finished size. Now, what if I want to make this into a 16-patch 12-inch finish quilt block size? So I'll take 12. 16-patch layout is 4 by 4. So 4, that'll be 3 inches. Take a 12-inch. If I want to do it into a 4-patch, that means 2 by 2. Divide that by 2, and that'll be 6 inches. Okay, so now remember, though, these are finished sizes. So let's have a look at this. Now, although the block, this quilt block in and of itself is unfinished, the finished size will be 8 inches. So if the finished size of this is 8 inches, then what is the finished size of each of these individual squares? Well, there's 4 of them. There's 4 of them here. It's in a 16-patch layout, so 4, 4. Again, finished size is 8 inches. 8 divided by 4, that's 2. So each of these individual squares will finish at 2 inches. Let's see if I'm right. Yep, that measures 2 inches. So this maroon colored square there, finish size, 2 inches. Okay, let's take a look at this block. Now, the finished size of this block is 7 inches. Now, on a rare occasion, you might actually get a block that is kind of an unusual number, or it doesn't divide equally. And so your measurements might be 1 1/4 or 2 1/2 or 3 3/4. It's not going to be a nice whole round number, but the math, not that much more difficult. So if this block finishes at 7 inches and it's in a 4-patch layout, then what is the finished size of each of the individual units? Meaning, what will the finished size of this be? 7 divided by 2, because 2 by 2, so 3 1/2. So finished size of the block, divide that by the number of units in each row or in each column, and that's the finished size of each of those units or the squares. So you just learned how to take the finished size of a quilt block and break it down to the individual finished unit size. Well, if I know the finished size, can I figure out what the unfinished size is? Yes, you can. You take the finished size and you add 1/2 inch, there's your unfinished size. Why 1/2 inch? So let's take a look at this square as an example. Now, this square measures 5 inches unfinished. Now, the difference between unfinished and finished, again, is that all the sides or edges of the fabric have been sewn in or have something else attached to it. Now, all of us know that within quilting, your seam allowance is 1/4 inch. If I have a piece of fabric sewn in on here, or if I make a seam here, I'm going to lose 1/4 inch in the length of the square. Same thing on this side. If I sew another piece of fabric on this side, I lose 1/4 inch here. So 1/4 inch here on the left, 1/4 inch here on the right. Add the 2 quarters together. There's your 1/2 inch. Let's bring this block back into the picture. Remember, we took a look earlier at the measurement for just this maroon colored block, and we found out that yes, through our math calculations, the finished size of this maroon colored square is 2 inches. So if I add ½ an inch to that, that means the original cut size of the square was 2.5. So when you know the finished size of whatever your quilting unit is, maybe in this case it's just squares for us, just to keep it simple, finished size plus ½ an inch, that's the unfinished size. So how does all of this kind of work together? Remember we said that this block will finish to 8 inches. 8 inches divided by 4, that meant that each of these individual squares here, the finished size was 2 inches. So the unfinished size, or the original size of the square before I started sewing it into this block, 2.5. And to elaborate further, if the finished size of this block is going to be 8 inches, then that means the unfinished size of the entire quilt block, well, that's 8.5. So you can kind of see that the math, if you can break it down, you can kind of build it back up just by knowing these simple concepts. So let's have a look at our challenge blocks for this episode. Now remember, the challenge blocks, well, you don't have to do them verbatim. You can kind of make up your own thing, or if you want to make up your own block, you can go right ahead. In fact, I would encourage you to actually explore and challenge your own self. If you don't want to do the blocks that I showcase as a challenge block, well, go ahead and make up your own block. It's okay to do that. I'm giving you permission. In fact, again, I'm encouraging you to do that, because now you'll really have to apply yourself, and well, you'll be on the way to being your own quilt designer. Now this block is just simply squares. It is in a 9-patch layout, and this block will finish at 6 inches. Now I did say it is a 9-patch. Where's the 9-patch? Well, you got one square there. You got one square there. And you got your third square there. So 3 by 3, 9-patch. So just by knowing, again, that this block will finish at 6 inches and it's in a 9-patch layout, well, you should then know what size each of these individual units are. Again, this block finishes at 6 inches, and it is in a 9-patch layout, which is 3 by 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Those facts in and of itself should tell you what size each of these units are. So what size is this square, total square? What size is that square? Or what size is that square? I know somebody's going to ask this, but Eric, you got a 4-patch unit here and multiple 4-patch units there. So what size are those 4 patches? Well, again, if you know the size of one square, then you can kind of figure out the size of what these units need to be. So if I can figure out what size each of these units need to be, then you know what size you need to make these 4 patches and what size you need to cut your fabrics to. So again, to recap, this is a 6-inch finished size block in a 9-patch layout. And just by that alone, you should be able to figure out what size each of these square units are. Now, if you are going to make the quilt top exactly like how I did it, well, I made about 18 of these. Not that I'm going to use all 18, but I just wanted to see what color combination, or just put different color combinations together. And when I finally get the quilt top put together, I may swap some of these blocks out with other different color combinations and whatnot. If you are going to copy the same or do some similar quilt top that I have planned with this, well, you might already know that this is going to be in an Irish chain quilt top layout or design layout. You're going to need to make multiples of these. Now, how many you need to make is actually going to depend upon, well, how you set the quilt block. Now, as we go along in this series, you'll kind of know what I mean. Now, you don't have to make all of these blocks all at the same time. You can kind of spread it out. I might need to make more depending upon how I lay out this particular quilt block or this particular quilt top. So like I said, you don't have to do the block exactly like how I have it. Here's a few alternatives. Now, I know for some of you, trying to figure out how to make this 4-patch or the sub 4-patch, for lack of a better word, that's what I'll call it, you might not be able to calculate it or calculate what size each of these squares are. Now, again, I'm kind of giving you the hint. If you can figure out what size that square is and that square is, then just take the size of this square and divide it by 2, or just redo the math, just focusing in on that one unit. But if you have a hard time trying to figure that out, well, modify the block. Here's an alternative where you see it's just nothing but just plain and simply squares. So again, the process of trying to figure out this is not going to be any different. Again, this is a 6-inch finished block in a 9-patch layout. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You should be able to figure out what each of these individual squares finish to. And you should also by then know how to calculate the unfinished size or the original cut size of each of those squares. But here's another alternative. Okay, notice that I have a combination of the different 4 patches as well as a solid square there in the middle. This is just another combination or another alternative of something that you can do. Now, if you're making the quilt top, any 3 of these combinations, well, they're going to work. When you look at the quilt as a whole, it's not going to make that much of a difference of whether or not you got the squares in one solid piece or if you have it broken down into even smaller pieces. You still get the Irish chain look. So play around with the size of squares, play around with different designs within each of the sub squares, whether you want to do it as a combination, whether you want to do it as just smaller square units like this, or whether or not you just want to do it as whole squares like this. Play around with that. Okay, I know that was a lot of information for the first video, so aren't you glad that I split this video into 2 separate sections? Now in this video, we went over the breakdown method. In other words, how do you take a block and break it down into its individual components or the individual squares or the units? In the next video, we'll do the exact opposite. We'll have the individual units, but we're going to try and calculate what the final block size is going to be. Essentially, we're just going to be working it in reverse. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I'll say it here again. I understand that sometimes you just have to ask a question because you just, well, it kind of goes right over you and you feel like you just don't understand it. And having a YouTube video tutorial like this, well, you don't get the opportunity to ask your questions to an actual live person. So to circumvent that, I am hosting Zoom meetings on the first Saturday of every month, and we'll do an additional Zoom sometime on the 3rd or the 4th week. If you are interested in joining one of these Zooms, well, send me an email at treasureheartcreations@gmail.com. I'll give you the information, and if you're available, you are welcome to join us live and, well, you'll ask us these questions. Now, it won't just be me answering it. I do have a few of the fellow Treasure Hearties that are going to be on the Zoom, and, well, they'll give you your perspective on how to solve the problem or how to help you understand the concept better. So again, that's treasureheartcreations@gmail.com. we'll get you signed up for it. That's it for this video, Treasure Hearties. And until the next video, or until we meet again, let's all create something.